In this lesson, we're going to talk about the historicity of the Gospels and the resurrection. And this means we want to examine the Gospels as a historical source to make sure they're historically accurate, and we also want to investigate how we know that we can trust them as a history. Then we'll move on to the resurrection and how we know that happened. But before we do any of that, if we're going to be Christians, we need to know that we can trust the Gospels, mainly because we call ourselves followers of Jesus. So, we need to know whether Jesus actually existed and whether the Gospels can tell us anything real about him. Now, if we're already Christian, we may take this for granted, but there are people who are not Christian to whom we would need to give answers and explanations. Now, going back to the existence of Jesus Christ, to deny Christ's existence is really not even serious scholarship. Basically, to say that Jesus didn't exist is as silly as saying that Abraham Lincoln didn't exist. So, this lesson is not about proving the existence of Christ, because that's just a historical fact that no serious scholar will debate. What is debated is who Jesus was. Was he divine like he said he was? Do the Gospels paint an accurate picture, and all of that? And most of all, did he really rise? That's what we're going to discuss in this lesson. So beginning with the historicity of the Gospels, in other words, are they historical? Can we trust them? And to preface all this, as we answer the question, we need to really look at what we mean by history and what we mean by historical. And the fact is that what we mean by history now is different from what it used to mean. In fact, history wasn't even considered an exact science until around the mid-19th century. And as you know, as we all know, this is long after the Gospels were first composed, and much longer after Jesus existed. Now, what we mean by exact science is what we currently expect from history. That they're going to tell us exact facts and exact dates, exact numbers of casualties in battles, and all that kind of stuff. But that wasn't the standard to which history was held until the mid-19th century. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that we're saying that every history written before the mid-19th century was inaccurate. That's not what we mean at all. In fact, many of those histories were highly accurate. It's just that the standards have changed. That's all I'm saying. Now, can we submit the Gospels, which were written before history was considered an exact science? Can we submit the Gospels to the same tests of historicity that we could submit modern-day historical accounts to? And we're going to see that we can. But first, we have to see exactly what these tests are. So here's the first test. Do they contain direct eyewitness testimony? It's common sense that a historical account based on eyewitness testimony is going to be much more reliable than something that's second or third hand. If I talk about something I saw in a sporting event because I was actually at the sporting event, that carries a lot more weight than if I talk about something that a friend told me who heard it from a friend who was at the sporting event, right? And so that's what this common sense criterion means. Second criterion, were they written within living memory of the events described? And were they thus subject to criticism? So living memory means that people who actually witnessed the event are still alive when the account of the event is published, and therefore those people can contest it. They can give their version. They can complain if the published version is different from reality. This is what living memory means. So I don't know, just a silly example. Let's say I go to the sporting event, the basketball game of one of my students, and I witness a super slam dunk of one of those students, and I tell one of my kids about it, and he writes it down in detail. But this written account of that super slam dunk I witnessed was not published, for whatever reason, was not published until 200 years from now. Oh, okay, well, maybe it happened, but the fact is that it was published outside of living memory of the actual event, so there's no one who can contest it. And so that published account of the slam dunk that I witnessed during a game at my school would not be so reliable and would just simply not pass this second test of historicity. Are they not fabulous, legendary, or mythical? So this is a negative criterion. An account is probably historical if it's not fabulous, legendary, or mythical. And we can usually tell that from the style in which it is written. For example, if we read Greek mythology, those are great stories, but we can tell from the style that it's not meant to be a history. It's meant to be a good story. The same is true if we read Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings does contain histories in it, historical events in it, or events. I don't mean historical events. I mean events that are chronicles of things that happened, fictional things that happened. But no one's going to claim that the Lord of the Rings is an actual history because it's not meant to be. It's meant to be a good story. And so as we're examining the historicity of the Gospels, and really of any historical account, even a history textbook, we can submit it to this third criterion and make sure that it is not fabulous, legendary, or mythical. Fourth criterion, do they meet the criteria of embarrassment and unexpectedness? And this is actually an important criterion because, often fact is stranger than fiction. And there are certain things that actually happened that we would never even think of inventing because they just seem so far-fetched and so impossible to imagine. The same goes for embarrassment. If the author publishes something that contains no embarrassing facts and just paints the author in a good light, and nothing but a good light, well, we might suspect it of being less than factual. The Gallic Wars of Caesar, for example. The Gallic Wars of Caesar are accepted history, but they don't really pass this fourth test. Now, they do pass the other four that we're going to learn, because we have a total of 5. This is the fourth. If the Gallic Wars fail the fourth but pass the other 4, they can still be considered good history. But the reason the Gallic Wars fail the fourth is because they're written by Caesar, and Caesar always paints himself in a really good light. He doesn't talk about events that would be embarrassing to him, because that's not his intent in writing. When an author includes things that are embarrassing to the author or to the group that the historical account is about, that actually lends more credence to the authenticity because we see that the author's not holding back any truth. Now, we're going to examine the Gospels in light of this, but just regarding the unexpectedness thing, going back to this idea that fact is stranger than fiction. Well, if I'm going to write a story, I probably want to write it in a somewhat believable way. I'm not going to include an anecdote in my story that I want people to believe if the anecdote is just too impossible. I mean, it wouldn't be credible. And yet, if something is historical about an event that actually happened, those events are often stranger than what we could even think of. And I know just a random example from my life, I actually witnessed it, is just a really simple thing. But I was at home eating lunch. I was probably around, 14 or 15. My brother was eating lunch with me. We were on a certain table that was actually partly in the kitchen and partly out. So it was kind of like a breakfast nook Still remember exactly where this was. And it just so happened that on the table there was a hat, and the hat was just sitting there on the table. One of us had taken off the hat as we were going to eat. And along comes a fly, and the fly lands on top of the hat. Okay, I know you were thinking random. Well, it was random because it actually happened. So the fly lands on top of the hat. And then, to make it even stranger, my brother gets this crazy idea that he's going to try to kill the fly. Not by swatting it, but by chopping at it with a blade. And not just any blade. It was a meat cleaver, all right? Big blade, meat cleaver. So he's literally he gets this crazy idea that he's going to take the meat cleaver and just whack that fly with it, the fly that is sitting on an empty hat, right? And I know what you're thinking, because this is really bizarre. But he did. He took the meat cleaver, he swung it at the fly that was sitting on top of a hat. And now the really crazy thing happened. He not only killed the fly, which was already a pretty impressive accomplishment, but with a meat cleaver blade, he chopped the head off the fly. I kid you not, I witnessed it myself. And there it was, the severed head of the fly. It was 1 in a million, right? But it's also the kind of thing that I would not invent, because I just wouldn't even think about inventing such a crazy story. A story that's very unbelievable, because how do you chop the head off a fly that's just sitting there? It's hard enough to just swat a fly with your hand. But why does this pass the fourth test? Because fact is stranger than fiction, and the reason why it's true is because it happened, and I saw it happen. And I really have nothing to gain by inventing such a silly story. Right? I don't get any money or fame for this silly story. But it happened, and it definitely passes the criterion of unexpectedness. All right, and finally the fifth test. The fifth test, last but not least, is, are they corroborated by multiple independent sources? So let's say I tell a story, and I don't know, something that I witnessed. Maybe it was a UFO. And I go outside, and I'm on my street walking the dog at night, and I see a UFO. All right, well, that passes the first criterion, eyewitness testimony. But if I go around and tell my neighbors about it and, post it on social media, it really doesn't mean anything unless there were other witnesses who are not even friends of mine. That's what independent means. Independent means that they are not connected to me as a person. So if I post it on social media that I saw a UFO, and then someone on the same night in a slightly different part of the city posts the same thing, and someone on the same night around the same time in a third part of the city posts it and even has a picture, well, of course that's going to make my account a lot more credible, because my account is corroborated by independent witnesses. All right, so these are the 5 tests of criteria. Now remember, a source that's considered historical doesn't have to pass all 5 perfectly. Caesar's Gallic Wars, for example, passed numbers 1, 2, 3, and 5, but we're still going to count them as good historical accounts. So it doesn't have to pass all of 5, but obviously if an account does pass every single one of the 5 and passes each one convincingly, well, then that's going to be it's pretty credible that we can say, yes, that account which passes all 5 is historical. So we're going to submit the Gospels to each one of these, and we're going to see how the Gospels actually pass each one. And so we will begin with eyewitness testimony. Do the Gospels pass the criterion of eyewitness testimony? Well, They do because their authors were either witnesses or very close to witnesses. All right, so let's talk about who these people were, the four evangelists, the four gospel writers. We know that Matthew and John were apostles, and as apostles then, they were writing a first-hand account because they experienced Jesus. They talked with Jesus. They saw what Jesus did. And they were witnesses as well of all of the events of his public life and his life after. Now, Mark and Luke were not direct eyewitnesses, but their testimony is powerful because they talked with and interviewed other eyewitnesses. We know that Mark was a traveling companion and an assistant of Peter. He's mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, sometimes as Mark, sometimes as John Mark. And we also know that Luke interviewed key witnesses, and Luke is really the gospel that tells us the most about the Virgin Mary, because Luke interviewed eyewitnesses, including Mary, and witnesses of the risen Christ. So we can say that they also pass this first criterion of historicity, because their accounts are so closely linked to direct eyewitness accounts. Now, John explicitly calls himself a witness to assert his credibility. We see this in John 19:35, John 21:24. You can look those up if you want to. Pause the video or whatever. Do it later. But the point is, I'm not saying this in a circular way that wait, the gospel that you're trying to prove the historical authenticity of calls itself a witness, therefore it does. No, I'm not saying that. That's obviously a circular type of reasoning. What I am saying, though, is that John, the writer, knew how important it was, knew how important this first criterion of historicity was, and that's why he explicitly wants to say it. He wants to give himself credibility by calling himself an eyewitness. All right? What that proves, really, is that it doesn't prove that he's a witness just because he says he's a witness. It proves how important the evangelists themselves thought eyewitness testimony was. So important that he's going to try to say it explicitly. Now, apparent conflicts between the gospel passages are minor. The order of temptations, the number and order of beatitudes, words of the Our Father, order of miracles, they are going to be slightly different, but they're never contradictory. Like, there's nothing that there's nothing in one version of the Our Father that's completely different from another, or the order of temptations when Jesus is tempted in the desert. If those are slightly different, it doesn't matter. What matters is what the temptations were. And so what I'm saying here is that apparent conflicts of details is just a consequence of the fact that you have different eyewitnesses. Let's go back to that weird slam dunk example I said. If I go to a game, my school's basketball team versus another school's basketball team, and I see one of our players do this, triple spin reverse dunk, and everyone's just, their minds are blown when they see it because it's just so amazing. Okay, for me, that was important. I noticed everything about the spin. Maybe another person's going to notice what kind of shoes the person was wearing. Another person will remember exactly what time of day it was and what minute it was of the game. My point is that when you have different eyewitnesses, you're going to have slightly different accounts, even though they all saw the same thing, but they're different people, and the details are important to them in different ways. Different things might matter to different people that don't quite matter to others. Like maybe the person who sees the athlete's shoes will say it, but me, I'm not even paying attention to the shoes. But the point in all this is that we have 4 different accounts based on eyewitness testimony. And so, of course, there will be slight differences. In fact, if there were no differences, we might get suspicious. Kind of like if I, as a teacher, am grading different essays, and maybe the essays are about something that students witnessed recently, and 3 essays are exactly the same, I'm going to think there was cheating. Okay, so it's normal that there should be differences. What wouldn't be good, though, is if the differences were mutually exclusive or contradicted one another, but they don't. So much so that the four accounts are easy to harmonize. And there is, this is an actual book title I'm giving you, The 4-in-1 Gospel of Jesus, Chronologically Integrated According to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by Nikolai Dimitrov. This is a masterpiece. And why I like it so much is because instead of reading 4 different Gospels, you can just read one. Because what Nikolai Dimitrov has done is he's taken every verse and harmonized them in perfect chronological order so that you can just read one account. So, a couple of verses might be Mark, and then John, and then Luke, but everything is so harmonious precisely because the 4 eyewitness accounts don't have any contradictory details. And this book is so good, in fact, that I use it every Holy Week during the holy days, especially during the Triduum, because I prefer, instead of jumping around from gospel to gospel, I like to just kind of read one book. And this masterpiece by Dimitrov allows me to do that. Wouldn't be possible, though, if the Gospels were not harmonious. Next criterion is date of writing. Was it written within living memory? And therefore, can the events written about in the historical account be contested? Can they be contradicted by people who saw the same events? If I write a historical account that's false and I publish it within living memory, you can bet there will be plenty of people who write negative reviews and say, "Oh, this is this is trash. This is all false. I saw the events and they didn't happen like this." But see, that wouldn't be possible if I were to publish something, or a descendant of mine were to publish something not within living memory. Now, the Gospels were written within living memory, and this is a very powerful test or criterion of historicity. So the Gospels of Mark, Luke, Matthew, and John were written in that order chronologically, but notice that even when the last Gospel was written, the Gospel of John, and it's been widely estimated that that Gospel was written in or finished by about 100 AD. Well, even then, there'd be people who perhaps they were little kids when the crucifixion happened, but they still would have remembered those events. It'd be hard to forget those events. And so in that case, right, we have to say that all the Gospels were written within living memory. If the Gospels had been published in, 400 AD, that'd be another thing. But they were all published well within the time when people could have remembered the events that were written about. Now, another argument for authenticity, or for how the Gospels pass this criterion, is that the first known heretical group was the Ebionite sect of Christian Jews who denied Christ's divinity. You could think of them as precursors of the Arians, and the Arians were very persistent heretics who came after this. But the point here is that if you have people who are still within living memory, people who still remembered the events of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, well, then those people are going to they're just going to stop any heresies in their tracks, because they're going to clearly be able to contradict heretics who have a different version of the accounts or different interpretation of the accounts. Now, we couldn't use this as an argument if the first heresy is already developed in 50 AD, but they didn't. They didn't. That is the earliest known heresy as far as Christian heresies, because heresies, or would-be heresies, wannabe heresies, were simply not able to be born during the time of living memory. There were too many Christians around to contest heretical opinions. Now, myths about St. Patrick such as the fact that or the legend that he banished all snakes from Ireland, or that he used shamrocks to preach the Trinity, or Saint Blaise, right, about some of his miracles. These happened a lot longer, or a long time after that those people actually lived. And I don't want to, not trying to burst anyone's bubble, because the shamrock story and the snake story, they sound great about St. Patrick, and I love St. Patrick, one of the greatest saints ever. But we don't have good historical reasons to believe either one of those anecdotes, because they arose so much longer after he lived. Those legends arose long after living memory. Same goes for Buddha, Muhammad, Nero. The thing about him fiddling while Rome burned, that's a legend. It sounds good. It's a good story. But that fact, or so-called fact, about Nero's life was published long after he or people who remembered him had died. And so we can say that a lot of things, quasi-historical accounts, don't pass this criterion, but the Gospels do pass it. And that brings us directly to the next test, or the next criterion, which is, are the Gospels legendary or mythical? We need to show that they're not, because if they are, that would cast doubt on their authenticity. All right, so the non- or anti-Christian historian frequently assumes a priori, which means without evidence, that any inexplicable event is mythical. But Christ's miracles were described as facts recognized by both believers and critics. So what we can see in the Gospels is there's plenty of evidence that people opposed Christ. They opposed Christians. And not only that, but that the very amazing supernatural things that were happening during Jesus' time, such as the multiplication of loaves and fish and the raising of Lazarus, these were recognized by Christ's enemies. They were reluctantly recognized by Christ's enemies. But it means that the lines of the gospel that are dedicated to describing these supernatural events, such as the raising of Lazarus, the multiplication of loaves and the fish, these lines of the gospel are not written in a mythical style, and they're not meant to be legends, precisely because many critics recognize that these things happen. In fact, after the raising of Lazarus, that's when the enemies of Jesus really decided to put their attempts in high gear and make sure that they could find a way to kill or to execute Jesus. Now, the miracles in the resurrection seemed incredible even to witnesses. And this goes back to what I was telling you guys about the fly, decapitating a fly with a meat cleaver. That's a strange event, right? But it happened. And these weird events, or amazing things that happened in the Gospels, were no different, in the sense that they were entirely, they seemed incredible. And it wasn't just followers of Christ who thought they were incredible. So did enemies of Christ. Everyone did. But the point is that the Gospels record events, some of which are very hard to believe or very surprising, and records it in a factual way, a way that isn't mythical, a way that is meant to be taken literally. Now, if the apostles had wanted to invent the resurrection account, how would they have known that Jesus would be unrecognizable? This is actually a really important thing, because we see in the gospel accounts that they often don't recognize Jesus right away. On the road to Emmaus, the disciples who were traveling there, they didn't recognize Jesus when he came up to walk alongside them. And even in about a week after the resurrection, when Jesus was or appeared to the apostles, the risen Christ did, and asked them if they'd caught any fish. it says in John 20, John 21, that has this account, it says that they didn't dare ask him who he was because they knew it was the Lord. However, they didn't know it was the Lord right away, because when Jesus said, "Children, have you caught anything?" they didn't recognize him right away. Now, that is a very strange thing to make up. It's not the type of thing you would invent, which all brings us back to the criterion of not legendary or mythical. In John 21, John is recording this as something that happened, and he's not seeing it in some kind of fabulous or mythical style, because he's just using a factual style to tell us what happened. Now, the doctrine of the Eucharist cannot be mythical language, since Christ did not interpret it as such. And we'll talk a lot more about the Eucharist in a future lesson, but the important thing here is that, in John 6, when Jesus says that he is the bread of life, and unless you eat his flesh and drink his blood, you have no life within you. When he says such things, he doesn't stop to explain himself, right? He doesn't say, "Oh, that was just me speaking symbolically. What I really meant was," no, it's not that at all. And so, because the language of John 6 is literal, and the language of John 6 is factual, it's just telling what Jesus said, we have good reason to believe that it actually happened, and that it wasn't just made up or invented. The fourth criterion, embarrassment and unexpectedness. And what this refers to is somewhat related to the last criterion, but not completely. This refers to events in a historical account that are so strange they couldn't be made up, not by any reasonable imagination. So let's first talk about embarrassment. All right, embarrassment. This means things that would tend to make people or make early century Christians look bad. And that's because the Gospels record certain details that really are quite embarrassing. If you are trying to invent a new religion, and let's say the new religion that you want to invent is Christianity, and you're a gospel writer, well, why on earth would you include things that might make people just believe that you are a fake, or make people question your motives, or doubt the Gospels in general? Why would you do such a thing? Unless those things actually happen. There are abundant details or embarrassing things. One of those is that, Peter, the first pope, this rock of the early church, who was supposed to have it all together, so to speak, he definitely didn't have it all together. And yet the Gospels give us this unflinchingly accurate portrayal of him and his personality and his mistakes, the biggest of which, of course, is denying that he even knew Jesus. That's embarrassing. Or how about the way that the apostles ran away? They ran away when Jesus was arrested in the garden, and at the foot of the cross, we only had John. Where were the others, right? This is embarrassing. It's even embarrassing that one of them betrayed Jesus. Wouldn't he have had better first followers than that, than to have a traitor in the ranks? These are things that are facts. They're inconvenient facts because they would maybe tend to discredit Christianity. But because they happened, that's why the gospel writers included them. We have the fact that Christ got baptized by John, and that might not seem embarrassing at first until we remember that John the Baptist's baptism was one of repentance, which meant that those who went to John the Baptist for baptism publicly repented of their sins and recognized their sinfulness. Well, for Christ to do that, especially since he was, claiming to be the Son of God, that would tend to cast doubt on his own authenticity and on the authenticity of the religion that he was founding. How about Joseph's plan to divorce Mary? That's not very honorable. Well, it's not meant to be a dig against Joseph. It's not at all. because Joseph was an honorable man. But what I mean is that it's not really the type of fact that you want to brag about. In that sense, it could be embarrassing. Of course, Joseph didn't know any better at the time, because before the Holy Spirit revealed the truth to him, he just assumed that Mary had been unfaithful. And so he was going to divorce her quietly instead of exposing her to shame and exposing her to stoning, which the law of Moses prescribed. But the point is that it's kind of the gritty and inconvenient detail that you would rather leave out if you're just trying to invent some kind of feel-good religion that you want people to belong to. Christ's death on the cross is extremely embarrassing for many reasons. The first reason it's embarrassing is because it basically means that Jesus failed in the human sense of the word, right? Here he was, the triumphant Messiah, entering into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and then he's just dead. In the way that the world was expecting the Messiah, this was an utter failure. It's an embarrassment. Or how about the fact that he died as a criminal, because crucifixion was reserved to criminals, not any criminal, just non-Roman citizen criminals. The scum of the earth would be crucified. And not just any crucifixion, but a crucifixion preceded by scourging, crowning, and him hanging naked on a cross. This is embarrassing. We tend to, maybe we sugarcoat it, or maybe we're just used to the crucifixion. But the Gospels paint us a very bloody picture, one that in a way, in the eyes of the world and what the world expected, was very embarrassing. How about the apostles' doubt even at the ascension? This is what we see. We see that they ask him if he's going to restore his kingdom now, and we are reminded of how human the disciples are. That they even doubt that this is going to happen. We see this, for example, in Matthew's account, in Matthew 28, 16 through 20. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. He's literally about to leave them. He's giving them the Great Commission to go out and preach the gospel, and it says some doubted. That's embarrassing. It's embarrassing because in the early church, they would much rather have been able to say that everyone was on fire with faith and ready to carry out their new mission. But that wasn't the truth. And the Gospels are all about recording the truth, even the embarrassing things. Now, regarding unexpectedness, so this is the second within the fourth criterion. If the Gospels were fictional, they wouldn't portray Jesus doing things that no one could reasonably expect. Just like if someone were to write a fictional account of me, they probably wouldn't include the thing about the fly and the head, because it just sounds so bizarre. Well, let's see what kind of unexpected things there were in the gospel. For one thing, Judas was the apostles' treasurer, not Matthew. Matthew had been a tax collector, so this would have made more sense to a myth writer. And I just found an error. Myth writer, not writer. All right. So this would have made more sense to a myth writer. The fact that Judas was appointed treasurer was unexpected. If I'm making up a story, and I want to make up a story about a tax collector who becomes an apostle because it sounds good, then obviously if I need someone to watch over the apostles' money, I'm going to use the money man in my story. But that's not what happened. Now, one interpretation of this, and this interpretation comes out in that TV show, The Chosen, which I love, by the way, but the interpretation there is that even though Matthew was kind of the natural choice to watch over the funds for the apostles, he didn't want to do it anymore because it reminded him too much of his old life. All right, that may or may not be true, but the point is, it's an unexpected fact that Judas was made the treasurer. And we don't know for sure that Judas had any business background. Christ's Sabbath work was unexpected. And this was actually very surprising to the Jews. In fact, it scandalized the Jews that Christ would work on the Sabbath. There are good rabbis that they followed before Jesus came along, and the good prophets, they didn't work on the Sabbath, but Jesus did. Or how about his love of enemies? The Jews were all about getting revenge on enemies because that was justice. Jesus talked about loving enemies. That was unexpected. It's not the kind of thing that the inventor of a Messiah myth would make up because it didn't fit the bill of what kind of Messiah they were expecting at the time. Or how about his not hand washing before meals? Basically, he scandalized people because they thought he was being an unfaithful Jew since he didn't follow that rule. At least he didn't always follow it, nor did his disciples. His commanding followers to eat his flesh and blood. Now, this is really mind-blowing because not only because of what I said earlier, that he didn't correct people, and so clearly he wasn't speaking in a legendary or mythical way, but just the bare fact of it, right? Eating flesh and drinking blood. I mean, doesn't that sound cannibalistic? Of course it's not. And there are good reasons for it not being, that we'll talk about later when we talk about the Eucharist. But aside from that, it's just not the kind of thing that an inventor of some guy named Jesus would come up with because it sounds so bizarre. It's unexpected. But these unexpected things, all here that were listed, and many more could be listed, these were recorded because they happened. That's the point of the fourth criterion of historicity. His silence in the face of accusations, when the expected reaction would have been self-defense, that would have been justice. That would have been normal. But Jesus was not an ordinary person. And he preferred to remain silent in the face of accusations, and he preferred to serenely accept the injustices that were being done to him. His often breaking social norms as a friend of pagans, prostitutes, lepers, and Samaritans. He ate with these people, he talked to them, he treated them as equals. This also scandalized people, and it was not the type of behavior you would invent. So regarding just this fourth criterion, what we're saying here is that if the author of a historical account includes things that could embarrass the author or the group he represents, or if his account includes things that no one could reasonably invent because it just wouldn't fit or wouldn't come up in a normal imagination, then it's most likely that those things actually happened. All right, and the fifth criterion is independent verification. Independent verification. So independent verification refers to other authors corroborating an account. And this, of course, lends credence to that historical account and makes us more confident that the things reported, the events reported, actually happened. Now, in the case of the Gospels, there are many other sources that mention facts about Jesus. Flavius Josephus, first century Jewish historian, he mentions Jesus. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, also known as Tacitus for short, first century Roman historian who mentions Jesus and Christians. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, who's also referred to as Suetonius for short, also first century Roman historian who mentions Jesus and Christians. Pliny the Younger, Mara bar Serapion, Lucian of Samosata, the Babylonian Talmud. These all talk about Jesus or Christians, and why we call it independent verification in this case is because these are not Christian sources. They are not sources who would be sympathetic to Christianity. They're non-Christian sources who are simply reporting facts. They're just reporting facts, historical facts. First century historians Thallus and Phlegon also mentioned the Good Friday hours of darkness, which are mentioned in the Gospels, but their writings have disappeared. However, they are quoted by other ancient historians. So what we're going to do next is we're just going to read some passages from these authors. just so you can see exactly what they said. It's really interesting. This is from Josephus. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. I'm going to change the margins of this document temporarily, just to make sure that nothing gets cut off by the little webcam. And so Josephus wrote this in Antiquities of the Jews. Kind of interesting, that line where he says he was the Christ. It almost sounds like a profession of faith. But as far as we know, Josephus was not a Christian. He was Jewish. Next is from Tacitus. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. So Tacitus here is talking about Christians, which is independent verification of the gospel accounts. At least because of the gospel accounts, we know that Christians existed. And certainly here, the existence of Christians is corroborated. Here's Suetonius. Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, Claudius, expelled him from Rome. Notice Suetonius he's actually misspelling Christus, or Christ. He's misspelling the Latin word for Christ, because he doesn't know what's going on. He's not a Christian. He doesn't even care. But he is talking about Christians. All right, this long passage is from Pliny the Younger, because he wrote a letter to Trajan asking or reporting on the situation in where he was in charge of, the land that he was in charge of, because he was the governor. And he said, those who denied that they were or had been Christians and called upon the gods in the usual formula, reciting the words after me, those who offered incense and wine before your image, which I had given orders to be brought forward for this purpose, together with the statues of the deities, all such I considered should be discharged, especially as they cursed the name of Christ, which it is said, those who are really Christians cannot be induced to do. Others, whose names were given me by an informer, first said that they were Christians and afterwards denied it, declaring that they had been but were so no longer, some of them having recanted many years before, and more than one so long as 20 years back. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the deities, and cursed the name of Christ. But they declared that the sum of their guilt or their error only amounted to this, that on a stated day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were God, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it. So here we see a clear reference to Christians in Bithynia, a place far removed from Rome, where Christians the Christian religion had spread. Now we have Mara bar Serapion. What else can we say when the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants? Their wisdom is captured by insults, and their minds are oppressed and without defense. What advantage did the Athenians gain from murdering Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as a punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato. Neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new law he laid down. And we're talking about the new law of Christianity, and the wise king is Jesus Christ. Now, the tragedy that befell Jerusalem after the crucifixion was the siege and the sacking of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 A.D. It was a really big deal because that's when Rome completely took over and put down all the rebellions of the Jews that were happening at the time. Josephus was actually part of that rebellion. He was eventually captured outside of Jerusalem at a place called Masada, but it was part of the same anti-Roman war. So interestingly enough, in this list we have Josephus, one of our corroborating authors, and he had to do with an event to which Mara bar Serapion refers here in this passage, and that was the where it says the kingdom was abolished, right here, which I just highlighted. Okay, next, the Babylonian Talmud. On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged. Yeshu would be a form of the Aramaic name for Jesus. It could be Yeshu or Yeshua. On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy." Now, when they're talking about Yeshu being hanged, what they're actually referring to is the crucifixion, because Jesus hung from a tree. He hung from a cross. And this is from Lucian of Samosata. He says, the Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. I love that term for Jesus, the crucified sage. But notice this is a non-Christian writer who's speaking pretty respectfully of Christians. He's not criticizing them, but he's one more proof that Christ and Christians existed, because he is an independent verifier, an independent corroborator, independent as in not Christian. And then our last little passage here is Julius Africanus, who writes of something that Phlegon said. And remember, Phlegon's writings have been lost, but they're referred to by other writers. Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th, manifestly that one of which we speak. On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. Now, this is a failure of the sun, which is recorded by the gospel because there was darkness over the whole land when Jesus was crucified. And then there was a red moon after that, which means a lunar eclipse. That most likely means that the failure of the sun was some kind of blocking out of the sun, not by the moon or anything, but just blocking out maybe just by heavy cloud cover, whatever it was. And we know this because an eclipse of the sun can't happen the same day as an eclipse of the moon. It's just an impossibility. But what did happen in the Gospels is a failure of the sun, and that night an eclipse of the moon with a blood moon. So everything we just read then is really interesting because it shows us that Jesus and those who followed him were well known to 1st and 2nd century historians. Now, if we apply this criterion of independent verification to some historical sources, those sources don't actually pass. Now, this isn't true of everything Tacitus wrote, but many of his writings are the only source in which certain ancient events are mentioned, yet no one doubts their authenticity. And what this means isn't that we're not saying that these other historians are bad. We're not saying that at all. We're saying that those other historians mostly pass the first four criteria and only partially pass the fifth. And yet we're still recognizing them as authentic historians. Now, how do the Gospels have an advantage over some writings of Tacitus, for example? Well, the Gospels have abundant independent verification, as we've just seen. All right, that we just read. That's also in the appendix of the textbook. The conclusion then is that the Gospels pass all five tests of historicity. Therefore, it is reasonable to suppose that they are factual. See, the Gospels pass all five tests, whereas other sources may pass three or four, or maybe four and then another one partially. But the fact that the Gospels pass all five tests means that the Gospels are very historical. In fact, the Gospels are more historically reliable than other sources, that we call history. And therefore, even though faith is a gift from God, and people have free will to reject faith or accept it, this is an area where someone could say, "Well, I don't believe the Gospels are historically reliable," and they can say that. But it's actually the more reasonable position to accept the historicity of the Gospels than to reject that historicity. All right, so these are some conclusions we can make. With great certainty, history tells us Jesus was a religious teacher who lived in Palestine and sought to purify and reform the worship of Judaism. I'm not ending the quote because I'm going to continue the quote in a bit. The quote isn't cited from some author. It's just stuff that we can say based on historical facts. And right now we're not making any statements of faith. He was followed by a group of intimate disciples, mostly from Galilee. The crowds looked upon him as a wonder worker and even hailed him as the promised Messiah. This is just the facts. All we're talking about is facts, no faith. His increasing influence aroused bitter opposition from the priests and Pharisees and led to his trial and crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. This is simply a fact. His followers affirmed his bodily resurrection, and no remains of Jesus' body have ever been found. All of these, in between these quotation marks, are just things that we can say about Jesus with absolute historical certainty and without having any faith in Christ. These are just historical facts that don't depend on faith. Now, since faith is reasonable, as we keep saying, and apologetics is all about reasonable faith, what we do when we get these solid conclusions is we bolster the faith we already have, which is that Jesus was the incarnate Son of God and Savior of man. Jesus was the incarnate Son of God and Savior of man. This is a statement of faith, but this statement of faith is based on the reasonable fact of the Gospel's historical reliability. The reasonable fact of the historicity of the Gospels. And this history, this real history, only serves to give foundation and strength to our faith. All right, in the next part, we're going to talk about the resurrection, and we'll continue this later.